The small town of Pine Valley hadn't changed much in the 5 years since Alex Thompson left for the Navy. The same old diner still served the best apple pie in 3 counties, kids still rode their bikes down Main Street after school, and Mrs. Chen's flower shop still filled the air with the sweet scent of fresh roses every morning. But Alex had changed. As he drove his pickup truck down the familiar streets, his right hand unconsciously rubbed the spot where his flesh met the prosthetic leg, a permanent reminder of that fateful day in Afghanistan. The doctors had called it a miracle that he survived the IED blast. His team had called it pure determination. Alex just called it doing his job. The auto repair shop came into view, its faded blue paint and weathered sign bringing a mix of emotions. This wasn't just any shop, it was his father's legacy. Old man Thompson had fixed cars here for 30 years before his heart gave out last winter. Alex had been halfway around the world when he got the news, and the military had arranged for him to make it back for the funeral. Now, 3 months after his medical discharge, he was back for good. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled into the parking lot. The morning sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows, revealing the familiar shape of tools and equipment inside. The place needed work, lots of it, but that was okay. Alex had always been good with his hands, and now he had all the time in the world to bring it back to life. As he stepped out of the truck, his prosthetic leg caught slightly on the doorframe. He'd gotten better at managing it, but some movements still took extra thought. A few early morning customers at the diner across the street tried not to stare, but Alex could feel their eyes on him. Small towns were like that, curious but trying not to show it. He didn't mind much. He'd rather have honest curiosity than fake indifference. Inside the shop, everything was exactly as his father had left it. The calendar still showed last December, the coffee maker still had old grounds in it, and Dad's red toolbox sat in its usual spot, covered in a thin layer of dust. Alex ran his fingers over the toolbox, leaving trails in the dust. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal brought back memories of summer afternoons spent learning at his father's side. He was halfway through checking the inventory when the bell above the door chimed. An elderly woman stepped in, squinting in the dim light. "Oh? I wasn't sure if anyone was here," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "The place has been closed so long." "Just reopened today," Alex replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What can I help you with?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Baker, explained how her car had been making a strange noise. As Alex listened and asked questions, he could see her initially tense shoulders relaxing. She'd probably been worried about finding a new mechanic after his father passed, but Alex's knowledge and gentle manner seemed to put her at ease. While he worked on Mrs. Baker's car, a simple loose belt, more curiosity seekers dropped by. Some were old customers, some were just neighbors, but all of them had known his father. Each shared a different story about how Old Man Thompson had helped them out of a jam or done them a favor. Alex listened to them all, learning new things about his father with each tale. By late afternoon, word had spread through town that Joe Thompson's son was back and reopening the shop. A steady stream of visitors continued, each one pretending they were just passing by. Some noticed his prosthetic leg but didn't mention it. Others asked about his service with awkward politeness. A few veterans who stopped in recognized the way he carried himself and gave him knowing nods. None of them knew about his years as a Navy SEAL. Alex preferred it that way. Those stories, the classified missions, the specialized training, the brotherhood forged in combat, weren't meant for casual conversation. He'd served with honor, done things that would never make the history books, and now he was home to live a quieter life. As the sun began to set, Alex stood in the doorway of his his shop now, and felt at peace for the first time in months. The work ahead wouldn't be easy. The shop needed updating, the books needed organizing, and his leg would sometimes make things challenging. But he was ready. This was his new mission, and he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else, one step at a time. What he couldn't know, was that his peaceful return to civilian life was about to be severely tested. The rumble of motorcycles could already be heard in distant parts of town, growing louder with each passing day. But for now, in this moment, Alex Thompson stood in his doorway, watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, and allowed himself to feel like he was finally home. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Alex reopened the shop. He was under a Honda Civic, fixing a leaky transmission, when the rumbling sound of multiple motorcycles filled the air. The ground seemed to vibrate as they pulled into his parking lot, their engines unnecessarily loud in a quiet neighborhood. Alex took his time sliding out from under the car, wiping his hands carefully on his work rack. Through the open garage door, he could see 5 motorcycles lined up like dark sentinels. Their riders were dismounting, all wearing matching leather vests with a snake-like emblem on the back. The leader, a tall man with a graying beard and cold eyes, stepped forward while the others hung back. "Nice little shop you got here," the man said, his boot heels clicking on the concrete floor. His voice had the kind of fake friendliness that set off warning bells in Alex's mind. "I'm Rick. My friends and I represent a business organization in town, the Silent Thunder Motorcycle Club." Alex stood quietly, his stance relaxed but ready, a habit from his training days. He'd heard about these guys from Mrs. Baker and other customers. They'd shown up about a year ago, gradually spreading their influence through Pine Valley and the surrounding towns. Local businesses had started experiencing accidents if they didn't pay for protection. "We offer insurance services," Rick continued, running his finger along a freshly cleaned workbench. "A lot of dangerous things can happen to a business these days. Broken windows, stolen tools, mysterious fires." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "For a reasonable monthly fee, we make sure none of that happens to our clients." The other bikers had spread out around the shop, examining tools and equipment with exaggerated interest. One of them picked up a wrench, testing its weight in his hand. Alex noticed how they'd positioned themselves, standard intimidation tactics, trying to make him feel surrounded. "That's thoughtful of you," Alex replied calmly, taking a seat on a nearby stool. His prosthetic leg was starting to ache, but he wasn't about to show any discomfort. "But I already have insurance. Good coverage too." Rick's fake smile flickered. "Maybe you don't understand. We're offering something special here. Personal service, round-the-clock protection." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. $500 a month. That's a bargain, considering all the bad things that could happen." Alex met his gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly, and I appreciate you taking the time to stop by, but I'm not interested." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Rick's eyes narrowed as he studied Alex, probably trying to figure out why this mechanic with a prosthetic leg wasn't showing the fear they usually inspired. The other bikers had stopped pretending to look around and were now watching the exchange intently. "You know," Rick said slowly, "your old man was smarter than this. He understood how things work now. It'd be a shame if his son ran this place into the ground." At the mention of his father, Alex felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he used to get before a mission. "My father taught me a lot of things," he said quietly, "including how to spot a bad deal when I see one. Now, unless you need actual mechanical work done, I have customers waiting." Rick straightened up, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You're making a mistake, friend. A big one." He gestured to his men, and they started filing out. "Think about our offer. We'll be back in a few days for your answer. Remember, accidents happen real quick in this town." Alex watched them mount their bikes and roar away, the sound echoing off the buildings. Once they were gone, he noticed his hands were perfectly steady, just like they always were in tense situations. Old habits die hard, he thought. That evening, as he locked up the shop, Alex made a few phone calls to some old friends who now worked in law enforcement. He described the visit, got some background on the Silent Thunder MC, and started putting together a plan. If these guys wanted to play tough, they had no idea what they were getting into. The next morning, Alex installed security cameras around the shop, high-end ones that would capture everything in crystal-clear detail. He also started keeping detailed records of every interaction, every threat, every suspicious incident. His military training had taught him the value of good intelligence and proper documentation. What the Silent Thunder gang didn't realize was that they weren't dealing with just another small-town mechanic. They saw a disabled man running his dead father's shop, an easy target. What they missed were the subtle signs. The way he moved with practiced efficiency, how he stayed calm under pressure, the strategic thinking behind his responses. They would learn soon enough. But for now, Alex focused on his work, helped his customers, and waited. In the Navy SEALs, he'd learned that patience was often the best weapon. The gang would make their move, and when they did, they'd find out exactly who they were dealing with. The harassment started small. First, it was just little things: trash scattered across the shop's parking lot every morning, mysterious late-night phone calls with no one on the other end. Alex documented everything, taking pictures and making notes with the same attention to detail he used during mission reports. One morning, he arrived to find crude words spray-painted across the shop's front door. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door was already there, trying to clean it off with household supplies. "Those horrible men," she said, her hands shaking with anger. "I saw them last night, but I was too scared to call the police." "It's okay, Mrs. Chen," Alex said, gently taking the cleaning supplies from her. "You were right to stay safe. I've got cameras installed now. They caught everything." He didn't mention that he'd already made copies of the footage and sent them to his contact at the FBI, who specialized in organized crime. The next week, customers started reporting that they'd been approached in the grocery store, at the gas station, even outside church. The message was always the same: taking their cars to Alex's shop might be dangerous for their vehicles. Some customers stopped coming, afraid for their cars and themselves. Others, like old Mr. Wilson, who'd been coming to the shop for 30 years, stayed loyal. "My daddy didn't raise no coward," Mr. Wilson declared one afternoon, handing Alex his keys. "And neither did yours, son. Joe Thompson would be proud of how you're handling this mess." That meant more to Alex than Mr. Wilson could know. He focused on fixing the timing belt in the old man's truck, trying not to think about how his father would have handled this situation. The work helped. It always did. There was something calming about the simple honesty of machines. They didn't play games or make threats. They just needed understanding and careful attention. One quiet afternoon, a teenager named Danny walked into the shop. Alex recognized him from around town. A good kid from a tough situation, trying to stay out of trouble. "I heard you might need help," Danny said, scuffing his shoes on the floor. "I know some stuff about cars. My uncle taught me before he went away." Alex studied the kid for a moment. He saw something familiar in those eyes, the same look he'd seen in young recruits, people wanting a chance to prove themselves. "Could always use an extra pair of hands," he said. "You know how to change oil?" Danny's face lit up. "Yes, sir. And rotate tires, and check brakes, and—" "All right then," Alex smiled. "Let's start with an oil change and see how it goes." Having Danny around turned out to be a blessing. The kid was a quick learner and genuinely interested in the work. More importantly, he brought a kind of energy to the shop that helped counter the growing tension in town. His presence reminded Alex of why he'd chosen to stand his ground against the Silent Thunder gang. It wasn't just about him anymore. But the gang wasn't giving up. They started parking their bikes across the street, watching the shop for hours. His phone buzzed, a text from his FBI contact. They were building a case, gathering evidence from other towns where the Silent Thunder gang operated. But cases like this took time, and meanwhile, innocent people were being frightened and harassed. Alex wheeled his chair to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade. His prosthetic leg ached. The weather was changing, and with it, his patience. He tried playing this their way, staying purely defensive, but they were starting to threaten people he cared about. Maybe it was time to show them what happened when they pushed too far. The next morning, when Rick and his gang members rode past the shop, Alex was outside, calmly drinking his coffee. He didn't react to their taunts or their revving engines. He simply watched them with the steady gaze of a man who had stared down far worse threats in much more dangerous places. Something in that look must have unsettled them. They rode away faster than usual. They didn't know it yet, but their campaign of intimidation was about to backfire spectacularly. Alex had learned in the SEALs that the best defense sometimes required a carefully planned offense. And he had a plan, one that would end this situation without a single punch thrown. The annual Pine Valley Summer Festival was a tradition going back 50 years. The whole town gathered in the park for games, food, and live music. This year, though, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The Silent Thunder gang had been getting bolder, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something had to give. Alex hadn't planned on attending the festival. His leg was giving him trouble after a long week at the shop, and large crowds still made him uneasy sometimes, a leftover from his deployment days. But Danny had begged him to come see the classic car show he helped organize, and Alex couldn't say no to the kids' enthusiasm. The festival was in full swing when Alex arrived. Children ran between game booths while their parents chatted over cotton candy and hot dogs. The car show had drawn a good crowd, with Danny proudly explaining engine specs to anyone who would listen. Seeing the teenager in his element, confidently sharing his knowledge, made Alex smile. The kid had come a long way in just a few weeks. "You've done good with that boy," Mrs. Baker said, appearing at Alex's side with a paper plate of fresh cornbread. "Whole town's noticed the difference in him. His mother was telling me at church how his grades are improving too." Alex accepted a piece of cornbread with a thank you. He's done all the work himself, just needed someone to give him a chance. The peaceful afternoon started to shift when the first rumble of motorcycles echoed through the park. Rick and his gang rolled in like a storm cloud, their bikes weaving between parked cars. People quickly moved out of their way, parents pulling their children closer. The gang parked near the car show, deliberately taking up spaces reserved for the classic cars. Alex watched as Rick strutted through the crowd, his gang spreading out behind him. They were making a show of it, wanting everyone to see their power over the town. Some festival goers started to leave, not wanting their families caught in whatever was about to happen. The situation took a turn when Rick spotted Danny explaining a restored Mustang's engine to a group of interested onlookers. "Well, look who it is," Rick called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet area. "Our little grease monkey, playing tour guide." Danny's voice faltered, but he stood his ground. The kid had grown braver over the past weeks. "I'm just showing them the cars, sir. No trouble." "No trouble?" Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's not what I hear. Word is you've been running your mouth about us, telling people we're bad for business." He stepped closer to Danny, towering over him. "Maybe you need to learn when to keep quiet." Alex was already moving before Rick finished speaking. His prosthetic leg slowed him slightly, but years of training had taught him to work with his limitations. He reached Danny's side just as Rick raised his hand to grab the boy's shirt. "That's enough," Alex said quietly, positioning himself between Danny and Rick. The festival had gone silent, everyone watching the scene unfold. Even the music had stopped. Rick's face twisted into an ugly smile. Well, if it isn't the stubborn mechanic, finally decided to come out and play. He looked Alex up and down, focusing on the prosthetic leg. "Though play might be the wrong word. Can you even stand up straight with that thing?" The other gang members laughed on cue, spreading out to form a loose circle. They were trying to create a ring, control the space like they controlled everything else in town. Alex had seen this tactic before. It was meant to intimidate, to make the target feel trapped. But Alex wasn't trapped. He was exactly where he needed to be. "Danny," he said calmly, never taking his eyes off Rick, "go help Mrs. Chen pack up her food stand. She'll need an extra hand." "But," Danny started to protest. "Now please." Something in Alex's voice made Danny listen. The teenager slipped away through the crowd, which had grown larger despite the tension, or perhaps because of it. Small-town folks were like that sometimes, drawn to drama but ready to help if needed. "Real brave," Rick sneered, sending the kid away. "Now it's just you and us." He cracked his knuckles theatrically. "No cameras here to record anything. No witnesses who'll dare speak up." Alex smiled slightly. "You're wrong about that. There are plenty of witnesses." He gestured at the crowd. "And folks here are tired of being afraid." "They should be afraid," Rick growled, stepping closer. "Fear keeps people in line, keeps them respectful, something you never learned. You know what real respect is?" Alex asked, his voice carrying across the silent park. "It's what these people earned by working honest jobs, helping their neighbors, building something worthwhile. What you're selling isn't respect, it's just fear dressed up in leather and cheap threats." Rick's face reddened. "Big words from a crippled mechanic. Let's see how smart you talk after." He never finished the sentence. His hand had shot out to grab Alex's shirt, and that was all the provocation needed. What happened next was so fast that many witnesses later couldn't agree on the exact sequence of events. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the watching crowd. As Rick's hand reached for Alex's shirt, years of training took over. With movements that looked almost graceful, Alex redirected Rick's grab, using the bigger man's momentum against him. Rick stumbled forward, caught off balance, and before anyone could blink, he found himself sitting on the ground, looking confused about how he got there. Two of Rick's friends rushed forward to help their leader. Alex moved with the same fluid efficiency. A quick sidestep here, a precise redirection there. It was like watching a carefully choreographed dance. His prosthetic leg didn't seem to slow him down at all. If anything, he used it to his advantage, letting opponents underestimate his balance and stability. In less than 30 seconds, 3 grown men were sitting on the ground, none of them quite sure how they'd ended up there. None of them were seriously hurt, just their pride. The remaining gang members stood frozen, unsure what to do. This wasn't going according to their usual script. An older man stepped out of the crowd, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile. He was wearing a veteran's cap with a Navy insignia. "I thought those moves looked familiar," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's SEAL training, isn't it, son?" The whispers started spreading through the crowd immediately. "Navy SEAL? Did he say SEAL? You mean like those elite soldiers?" Rick's face had gone from red to pale. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This is some kind of trick." The older veteran laughed. "No trick about it. Saw those same moves in '91 when a SEAL team trained with our unit. You boys just picked a fight with the wrong mechanic." More veterans in the crowd were nodding now, recognizing the distinctive fighting style. Mrs. Baker was beaming like she'd just won first prize at the county fair. Even the local police chief, who had arrived moments earlier, was trying to hide a smile. "Now," Alex said calmly, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "we can handle this one of 2 ways." He looked at Rick and his gang members, who were slowly getting to their feet. "You can leave town quietly, never come back, and we'll call it even. Or," he gestured to the police chief, "we can discuss all the evidence I've been gathering about your business practices with the proper authorities." One of the younger gang members was already backing away toward his bike. Another was trying to look tough while edging toward the exit. They'd signed up for easy intimidation, not a confrontation with a highly trained veteran. Rick looked around, seeing his power over the crowd evaporating. People were standing taller now, looking him in the eye instead of turning away. A few were even smiling. His carefully built image of fear was crumbling, and he knew it. "This isn't over," Rick tried to sound threatening, but his voice cracked slightly. "Actually, it is," the police chief stepped forward. "I just got word from the FBI office in the city. They're very interested in talking to you about some activities in other towns. Might want to have a lawyer present for that conversation." Danny had reappeared at the edge of the crowd, grinning from ear to ear. Mrs. Chen stood next to him, recording everything on her phone. Other phones were out too. The whole scene would be all over social media within hours. The remaining gang members were already starting their bikes, ready to leave before things got worse. Rick looked at his departing crew, then back at Alex, who stood quietly watching. For a moment, something like respect flickered across Rick's face, not the fake respect he demanded through fear, but real recognition of someone who had outmatched him completely. Without another word, Rick turned and walked to his motorcycle. The rumble of engines filled the air as the Silent Thunder gang rode away from the festival and from Pine Valley for the last time. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People surged forward to pat Alex on the back, shake his hand, or just stand nearby and share in the moment. Mrs. Baker was wiping happy tears from her eyes, and Danny looked like he might burst with pride. "Why didn't you tell us you were a SEAL?" someone asked. Alex shrugged. "Never seemed important. I'm just a mechanic now." The older veteran who had spoken up earlier shook his head. "Son, you're a lot more than just a mechanic. You showed this town something important today. That standing up to bullies doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it's about being smart, being patient, and knowing when to act." The festival gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The music started playing again, children returned to their games, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. But something had changed in Pine Valley. People walked a little taller, smiled a little easier, knowing their town was their own again. The days following the festival brought big changes to Pine Valley. News of what happened spread quickly, not just through town, but to neighboring communities as well. People who had been living under the Silent Thunder Gang's shadow for months finally felt free to speak up. Alex's phone started ringing with calls from business owners in other towns, each with their own story about the gang's intimidation tactics. He directed them all to his FBI contact, adding their testimonies to the growing case. The evidence he'd been carefully collecting, security footage, financial records, witness statements, proved invaluable to the investigation. "You really planned this all along, didn't you?" Danny asked one afternoon as they worked on a transmission replacement. The teenager had become a constant presence at the shop, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Alex smiled as he handed Danny a wrench. "In the SEALs, we learned that the best operations aren't about brute force. They're about patience, planning, and letting the target make their own mistakes." "But weren't you worried?" "When they were threatening people, damaging the shop." "Worried? Sure." Alex wiped his hands on a shop rag. "But I've dealt with worse. Those guys were bullies, and bullies follow patterns. Once you understand the pattern, you can predict what they'll do next." The shop was busier than ever now. People who had been afraid to bring their cars in were returning, often with stories about how the gang had affected their lives. Old customers brought new ones, and Alex found himself considering hiring another mechanic to help handle the workload. One morning, the police chief stopped by with news. The FBI had arrested Rick and several other gang members in a coordinated operation across 3 states. The evidence trail led to bigger crimes than just local intimidation, money laundering, drug trafficking, and worse. "You did this town a real service," the chief said, leaning against a workbench. "Though I have to admit, when you first reopened the shop, I was worried you might bring trouble. Lots of veterans come home with issues to work through." Alex nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. "The transition isn't always easy," he admitted. "But having a purpose helps. This shop, helping people, it gives me something to focus on besides what happened overseas." As if on cue, Mrs. Chen appeared with her usual lunchtime delivery of homemade dumplings. She'd been bringing food ever since the festival, claiming Alex was too skinny and needed feeding up. Today she had extra, having heard Danny would be there after school. "My nephew was in the army," she said as she set out the food. "He came back different, quiet. But helping in my shop made him smile again. Sometimes the best medicine is just having somewhere to belong." Word of Alex's background had spread, but not in the way he'd feared. Instead of treating him differently, the town seemed to appreciate his humility more. He wasn't just the Navy SEAL who stood up to the gang. He was the mechanic who fixed Mrs. Baker's car at cost when she was struggling to make ends meet, the mentor who gave Danny a chance when others had written him off. The local high school asked if he would speak to their students about his experiences. At first, Alex was hesitant. Public speaking had never been his thing. But when he saw how the kids listened, especially the troubled ones who reminded him of himself at that age, he realized he had something valuable to share. "It's not about the fights you win," he told them. "It's about the fights you prevent. The strongest people I knew in the SEALs weren't the ones who could bench press the most or run the fastest. They were the ones who could keep their cool under pressure, who could think their way through problems instead of just reacting." Danny sat in the back of the classroom during these talks, beaming with pride. The kid had become something of an unofficial spokesman, explaining to anyone who would listen how Alex had taught him about more than just cars. He taught him about respect, patience, and standing up for what's right. The auto shop itself underwent a transformation. With business booming, Alex could afford to make improvements. He installed a new hydraulic lift, updated the diagnostic equipment, and even hired a part-time bookkeeper to help manage the growing workload. But he kept his father's old red toolbox in its place of honor, a reminder of where it all started. One quiet evening, as Alex was closing up the shop, he found himself thinking about how different things were from just a few months ago. The town had changed, yes, but so had he. Running the shop wasn't just about carrying on his father's legacy anymore. It had become his own mission, his way of continuing to serve, just in a different uniform. The sound of motorcycles still occasionally echoed through Pine Valley, but now they were just passing through. The town had learned its own strength, and the days of being pushed around were over. As Alex locked the shop door and headed home, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best victories were the quiet ones, won not with fists or weapons, but with patience, wisdom, and a community standing together. 1 year after the festival showdown, Pine Valley had transformed into a different place. The auto shop, now sporting a fresh coat of blue paint and a new sign, had become more than just a business. It was a gathering spot for the community. On any given day, you might find veterans sharing stories in the waiting room, teenagers learning about cars after school, or neighbors stopping by just to say hello. The morning started like any other, with Alex arriving early to get paperwork done before the day's appointments. Danny was already there, organizing tools with the efficiency of someone who had found his true calling. The teenager had earned his certification in automotive repair and was now a full-time employee, his college fund growing with each paycheck. "Got something to show you," Danny said, practically bouncing with excitement. He led Alex to the back of the shop, where an old Mustang sat under a tarp. "Remember that classic car from the festival? The owner's selling it. Says he'll give us a good deal if we fix it up for the shop." Alex ran his hand along the car's dusty hood, memories of last year's festival playing in his mind. Could be a good project, he mused. Teaching opportunity too. The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Baker walked in with her usual Thursday morning coffee delivery, a tradition she'd started after the gang left town. "You boys seen the newspaper yet?" she asked, setting down the cups. The front page featured a story about the Silent Thunder Gang's trial. Rick and his top lieutenants had received lengthy sentences, their criminal empire dismantled by the evidence Alex and others had helped gather. But that wasn't what Mrs. Baker was excited about. "Turn to page 3, she urged. There, taking up half the page, was an article about Pine Valley's transformation. It highlighted the town's economic revival, the new youth mentorship program at the auto shop, and the way the community had come together. Alex's story was part of it, but the focus was on how one person's stand had inspired an entire town to reclaim its identity. "They interviewed me for that," Danny said proudly. "Told them how you gave me a chance when nobody else would." Alex was about to respond when he noticed a group gathering outside the shop. Mrs. Chen was there with her dumplings, Mr. Wilson with his ancient truck that always needed fixing, and dozens of other familiar faces. Someone had hung a banner across the front of the building. 1 year of freedom. Thank you. "What's all this?" Alex asked, stepping outside. The police chief stepped forward. "Well, we figured this anniversary deserved some recognition, not just because you ran off those thugs, but because of what you've built since then." He gestured to a group of teenagers working on cars under Danny's supervision. "That mentorship program you started, it's helped more kids than you know. The county's looking to use it as a model for other towns." Mrs. Chen wiped a tear from her eye. "You gave us back our dignity," she said softly. "Showed us we didn't have to live in fear." One by one, people stepped forward to share how the past year had changed their lives. A young veteran talked about how working at the shop had helped him readjust to civilian life. A single mother described how the auto repair classes had saved her money she desperately needed. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of community that had been woven. Alex stood quietly, his prosthetic leg aching slightly from the morning's work, but his heart full. He thought about his father, about how proud he would be to see what the shop had become. It wasn't just fixing cars anymore, it was fixing lives, one person at a time. Danny appeared at his side with a small package. "Found this in the old storage room," he said. "Thought today was the right time to bring it out." Inside was a faded photograph of Alex's father standing in front of the shop on its opening day, young and proud and full of dreams. Alex placed it carefully on the wall next to his father's old red toolbox. "You know," the police chief said, looking at the photo, "your daddy always said a mechanic was part doctor, part therapist, and part magician. Looks like he passed that wisdom down." The celebration continued through the morning, with people coming and going, sharing stories and food and laughter. Kids played in the parking lot where game motorcycles had once threatened. Veterans swapped tales in the corner where intimidation had once ruled. The air smelled of Mrs. Chen's dumplings and fresh coffee and hope. As Alex watched his community, his family, celebrate, he realized something profound. His years as a Navy SEAL had taught him how to fight, but running the shop had taught him how to heal. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't won through strength or skill, but through simple acts of kindness, through believing in people when they didn't believe in themselves. The day wound down as days do, but the feeling of community lingered. As Alex locked up that evening, Danny finishing his last oil change and Mrs. Baker gathering her empty coffee cups, he looked at the photo of his father one more time. "We did good, Dad," he whispered. "We did good." The sun set over Pine Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The auto shop stood as a beacon of what was possible when people stood together, when fear was replaced with hope, when a community decided to write its own story. And in the quiet of the evening, if you listened carefully, you could hear the sound of healing, in the laughter of teenagers learning a trade, in the grateful thanks of customers turned friends, in the steady heartbeat of a town that had found its courage again.